Sima Chan held his brush above the paper and did not move. The sentence he had just written described a man named Li who had served as keeper of archives in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty, and who had lived perhaps in the 6th century before the Common Era, and who was perhaps the author of a short text of some 5,000 characters that had been copied and recopied for centuries before Sima Chan himself was born. The historian had written the sentence carefully. He had set down what his sources gave him and had stopped there. And now he held the brush above the ink-wet paper and considered whether what he had written was true. He was a careful man. He had spent his life among records, among the dust of accumulated testimony, among the names of kings and the dates of battles and the accounts of ministers who had served and fallen and been forgotten. He understood better than most people the difference between what had been observed and what had been passed along, and what had simply been believed for long enough. That belief had started to feel like memory. He wrote the sentence anyway. He kept the uncertainty inside it, like a small hollow at the center of something solid, and he let the hollow be there, and he moved on. This is where the Tao Te Ching begins, not in a mountain monastery, not in a moment of visionary illumination, not in the clear light of a philosophical system announcing its first principles, but in a historian's honest hesitation, in the brush held above paper, in the acknowledgement that what is being written about is already, and has always been, partly beyond reach. It begins in the space between knowing and not knowing, which is perhaps the most appropriate beginning a text like this one could have. The man Sima Chan was describing had worked in the royal archives of the Zhou court. This detail matters more than it first appears. The archives were not merely administrative records. They were the accumulated cosmological and ritual and political memory of a civilization that had been building its categories of understanding for centuries. Records of heaven's movements, records of the rites that kept human society in alignment with those movements, records of the sage kings whose governance had been held as the standard against which all subsequent governance was measured. The keeper of these archives was not a bureaucrat. He was a reader of everything that the civilization had managed to set down about the nature of things, from the behavior of stars to the proper relationship between sovereign and subject, to the meaning of the seasons as they turned and returned, without anyone asking them to. If Laozi read all of this, and the legend suggests that he spent his life among it, then what he found at the center of those records was not a final answer, but a silence, not the silence of a question unasked, but the silence of a question that every answer had circled without touching. The records were full of names and categories and rites and correspondences. This star governs this territory. This season requires this sacrifice. This virtue produces this result. And at the center of the whole elaborate structure was something the structure could not hold, or name or account for. Something that the silk scrolls, however carefully they were kept, could only gesture toward in their margins. He kept the archives. He read everything, and he found at the end of everything an opening. The Zhou dynasty was old by then. It had governed, in its fashion, for centuries, and its governance had grown thin in the way that old authorities tend to grow thin. Not gone, but hollowed, the form persisting after the substance has quietly withdrawn. The great states that nominally owed allegiance to the Zhou king were already, in practice, sovereign powers pursuing their own interests, their armies in motion across the central plains, their ambitions scaling upward, while the old ritual order slowly lost its hold on events. Laozi, in Sima Chan's telling, watched this from the archives, from among the records of what had been, and at some point decided that he had seen enough. The decision to leave is the one Sima Chan is most certain about. He left westward. The road out of the Zhou capital would have carried him through settled country before it climbed toward the passes in the mountains that marked the edge of the known world. The edge, that is, of the world the Zhou archives had records for. Beyond those passes was not exactly nothing, but it was beyond the administrative reach of anything that had been written down in the rooms where he had spent his working life. He left on a water buffalo. This is the detail that has stayed in the story across 25 centuries, and it deserves a moment of attention. Not a horse, with its speed and its associations with military power and aristocratic display. A water buffalo, patient, unhurried, low to the ground, proceeding at its own pace through terrain it had no interest in conquering. The animal moved, and the old man moved with it, and the city sounds behind them became quieter with each slow hour until there was only the breathing of the animal and the creak of the saddle and the sound of a road that was narrowing towards something. The pass was called Hungu. It sat in the mountains at the western edge of the Zhou domain, and it was the kind of place that exists in many traditions as a threshold, the point where the ordered interior of the known world gives way to whatever lies beyond categorization. Passes like this one have a particular quality of light in the late afternoon, when the sun is behind the peaks and the valley below is already in shadow, and the air holds a coolness that the plains have not yet arrived at. The man traveling through such light towards such a pass was by any ordinary measure unremarkable, an old man on an old animal, leaving. The border guardian at the pass was a man named Yinshi. What Sima Chan records about him is specific. He saw the approaching figure from a distance and felt something he could not easily articulate. He felt, the account suggests, that he was watching someone who would not be coming back. Not because the road ahead was dangerous, roads beyond the pass were traveled, if less frequently, but because the man on the buffalo had the quality of someone who was genuinely finished, not in the way of defeat or exhaustion, but in the way of someone who has completed what they came to do, and is now, quietly and without drama, concluding the part of existence that required staying. Yingshi stepped forward. What he asked for was not a name or a statement of business or a reason for departure. He asked, according to the story, for wisdom. More precisely, he asked that the old man set down his understanding before he vanished into the west, that he leave something behind for the world he was leaving. It is the request a border guardian makes when he understands, in the moment of making it, that borders are also thresholds, and that what is about to cross this one will not return, and that the chance to ask is exactly as long as the time it takes for the buffalo to pass through. Laozi agreed. He dismounted, or did not dismount. The story does not specify, and he composed, or dictated, or wrote in a single sitting a text of approximately 5,000 characters, divided into 81 short chapters, and then he crossed the pass and was gone. 5,000 characters, 81 chapters. These numbers carry their own significance in the Chinese tradition from which this text emerged, and the significance is not arbitrary. 9, in classical Chinese numerology, is the most fully expressed of the Yang numbers, the number that contains the maximum of positive, active, assertive force that the cosmological imagination could attribute to a number. 9 multiplied by 9 is 81. The structure of the text, in other words, encodes something about what it is doing with that force, not asserting it, not celebrating it, but containing it, attending to it, and folding it into something quieter and more lasting than force alone. The text was divided, in most of the traditions that preserved it, into two parts. The first part, the Tao Ching, concerned itself with the nature of the Tao itself, the underlying ground from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The second part, the Tao Ching, attended to Ta, often translated as virtue or power or the inherent quality of a thing, the way the Tao manifests in particular forms, in governance, in the sage, in the ordinary unfolding of life among the 10,000 things. Tao and Te, the ground and its expression, the root and the flowering that rises from it, which is not separate from the root, but cannot be confused with it either. The division of the text into these two parts and the order in which the parts appeared was something that scholars and copyists and commentators took for granted for many centuries. The Huangbi edition, produced by a brilliant and short-lived scholar of the 3rd century of the Common Era, arranged the text with the Tao Ching first and the Te Ching second, and this arrangement became, for a very long time, the arrangement that was meant when people spoke of the Tao Te Ching. Huangbi was 20 years old when he wrote his commentary. He died at 23. His edition, composed in the brief interval of his short life, became the standard through which generations of readers entered the text until the winter of 1973. The site was Mawangdui in Hunan province. The Han Dynasty tombs there had been sealed for approximately 2,000 years. Sealed, that is, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, which means they were sealed roughly contemporary with or slightly after the period when Sima Qian was composing his uncertain biographical account of Laozi. Inside the tombs, laid flat in the specific preserved darkness that archaeological sites sometimes achieve when conditions align in their favor, were 2 silk manuscripts. Both were copies of the Tao Te Ching. Both predated the Huangbi edition by several centuries. Both were different from it in ways that are still being considered by scholars who have spent their careers with nothing else. The most arresting difference was the order. In both Mawangdui manuscripts, the Te Ching comes first, the section that the canonical tradition had always placed second, the section concerning virtue and governance, and the expression of the Tao in the world of particular things, was the section with which these 2 older manuscripts began. The chapter that had been numbered 1 in every edition most readers had ever encountered was numbered 38 in these versions from the Han Dynasty tomb. This is the kind of discovery that does not make the landscape collapse, but does make it shift, perceptibly, beneath the feet. A reader who has spent years with the text, who has entered it always through its famous opening line, who has built a sense of the whole from the part that comes first, picks up a translation based on the Mawangdui texts, and finds that the door they always used is not the first door, that there is another door, older, which opens into the same house from a different angle entirely, and that the house looks different from inside it when the light falls from that direction. The architecture is the same. The walls are the same walls, but the shadows fall differently, and some rooms that seemed peripheral now seem central, and some details that seemed decorative now seem load-bearing. What does it mean for a text to have no single authoritative version? It means in part that the Tao Te Ching has been doing, across the history of its own manuscript tradition, something like what it argues should be done in life, holding its form loosely, allowing variation without anxiety, persisting through change, rather than against it. The text about yielding has yielded. The text that was composed at a threshold has continued to inhabit thresholds, to live in the uncertainty between one version and another, one order and another, one translation and another. It has not resolved into a single fixed thing, which may be, depending on how one holds the observation, either the most profound irony in the history of philosophy or its most precise demonstration. Sima Chan wrote his account of Laozi in the 1st century before the Common Era and included in the account several alternative versions of the story, a different man who might be Laozi, a different origin, a different timeline, because he was honest about what his sources gave him and what they did not. He was a historian who understood that the truth about some figures lies precisely in their resistance to biographical certainty, that the blurring of the figure is not a failure of the record, but a quality of the figure itself. Some people live in a way that is genuinely difficult to see clearly from the outside, not because they are hiding, but because the light around them does not organize into the kind of clarity that biographical records require. Laozi as a figure has this quality entirely. He may have been one man or several men whose traditions were later folded together. He may have lived in the 6th century or the 4th. He may have met Confucius, as one famous account suggests, in an encounter where the younger man came seeking advice about ritual, and the older man offered something so much more unsettling that Confucius reportedly left the meeting in a state of deep disturbance, comparing what he had encountered to a dragon, something that moves between heaven and earth and cannot be caught or categorized. Or this meeting may never have happened at all. The meeting may be a later invention, composed by someone who understood that the most instructive way to introduce two traditions of thought to each other was to put their attributed founders in a room together, even if neither man had been in that room. What the uncertainty gives back, when it is held without frustration, is a sense of the text's actual nature, not a document delivered by a historical person whose authority secures its claims, but a distillation, a gathering, a gift offered at a threshold by someone who had spent a life reading everything and found, at the center of everything, an opening that all the reading was pointing toward without quite arriving at. The text is what was set down before the crossing. It is the last transmission from the known world to whatever lies beyond the pass, and the person who set it down was already, in the moment of setting it down, in the act of leaving. The royal archives of the Zhou court were full of silk scrolls. Each scroll had been handled by the hands of archivists before the man named Li and would be handled by the hands of archivists after him, and would continue to accumulate information about the known world, about rites and stars and the movements of armies and the succession of kings, long after the particular reader who found the silence at the center of it all had ridden westward on a patient animal and disappeared into the mountains. The archives would persist, the records would be maintained, the categories would be added to, refined, debated, and occasionally overturned, and the text that had been composed at the edge of all of this, in a single occasion on a mountain threshold, would be copied and copied and copied again, wearing its uncertainty lightly, changing as all living things change, persisting as all deep things persist. In 1973, in the darkness of a Han Dynasty tomb in Hunan province, two silk manuscripts waited in the particular stillness of things that have been sealed away from time. They had been there for 2,000 years. 2,000 years is a number that the mind produces and then immediately finds it cannot actually hold. It is too large for felt comprehension, and so the mind tends to convert it into a general sense of oldness, of weight, of distance. These two manuscripts, in their darkness, did not know they were old. They simply were. The characters written on them were the same characters they had always been, the same shapes, the same strokes, the same arguments about water and emptiness and the usefulness of the hollow center, the same counsel about the ruler who governs best by barely being known, all of it preserved in darkness, unhurried, requiring nothing, waiting with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. When the earth above them was opened in 1973, and the conservators reached down, and the light came in again, what they found was that the text had survived. Not perfectly. Silk does not survive 2,000 years without damage, but sufficiently, enough to read, enough to see that the order was different, enough to understand that the text, even the text about the ground that does not change, had a history that was still being uncovered. There is a quality that belongs to the act of reading a very old text for the first time, or more precisely, to the act of reading a very old text and encountering it as old, as something that arrived from a real past and has crossed real distance to be here, in these hands, at this moment. It is not the same as reading a contemporary argument, however sophisticated. It carries a different weight. Not the weight of authority, not the weight of age as such, but the weight of something that has persisted, that has outlasted the dynasties that commissioned and suppressed and recommissioned it, that has outlasted the scholars who argued over its correct interpretation, that has outlasted the manuscripts that carried it forward into the next century and the one after that. The weight of something that has proved over a very long time difficult to let go of. A reader today who holds a translation of the Tao Te Ching is holding something that has traveled from a scribal table in ancient China through a succession of hands and occasions so long and varied that the chain of transmission is effectively invisible by now. Most of its links lost, the hands that made the copies unnamed and unremembered, the decisions about which version to preserve and which to set aside made by people whose names are not recorded and whose reasons are not available. And yet the text is here. It made the crossing. Whatever it was composed to carry across the threshold at Hanggu Pass, it has been carrying in various ways and with various losses and additions for somewhere between 24 and 26 centuries. The story of Yinshi, the border guardian, has stayed in the tradition for a reason that may be the most straightforwardly human reason in all of philosophical mythology, because it describes the experience of recognizing, in the moment of almost missing it, something worth asking for. Yinshi did not know, when he saw the figure on the buffalo approaching the pass, what the figure was carrying. He felt something. He stepped forward. He asked. And what he received by asking was not a lecture or a system or a set of principles organized into an argument for the benefit of posterity. What he received was a gift, the kind of gift that is offered at the exact moment of departure, composed at the edge rather than at the center, set down not for institutions or academies or posterity in general, but for a single person who had the presence to ask before it was too late. That is what the border guardian received, and what he did with it, whether he kept it or copied it or carried it back to the city from which the old man had come, is not recorded. The story ends at the threshold. The request is made, the text is given, and Laozi continues westward into the passes until the figure is too small to see, until the dust of the road settles behind the last footfall of the water buffalo, until the particular quality of late afternoon light at Hangi holds nothing but the pass itself, and the road, and the air, and the distance, the same distance that has always been at the western edge of every world anyone has ever managed to name. Yingxi stood there holding what he had asked for, and watched the space where the figure had been, and the space held nothing now except the mountains and the sky and the going of the light, which was slow and even and did not announce itself, and which continued as it always continued, without waiting for anyone to be ready. A hand moves across silk in the dim light of a conservation laboratory. The year is 1973, and the silk has not been touched in more than 2,000 years. The conservator's fingers stop just short of the surface, not quite touching, hovering at the distance of a breath, and the characters of the opening line come slowly into focus, the ink still dark against the yellowed ground, as clear and as patient as the day they were set down. She has seen old text before. She has handled things that came from a long way back in time, but something in the quality of stillness that rises from this surface makes her pause before she reads, the way a person pauses at the edge of a very deep pool before looking in. She reads the characters slowly, the way one reads a thing already known by a different kind of knowing than memory. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. She reads it again, not because she did not understand it the first time, but because it is the kind of sentence that opens further the second time, and further still the third, the way a door that appears to be a wall reveals itself by degrees, not all at once but gradually, as the light changes. There is a particular quality of silence that follows certain sentences. Not all sentences make silence. Most sentences simply end, and the air they move through settles back into its ordinary arrangement. But certain sentences, when they finish, leave behind them something that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of open space. The way a stone dropped into deep water sends its rings outward and outward until the surface is still again, but a different kind of still than before, a stillness that has been touched by the depth below it. The first line of the Tao Te Ching makes that kind of silence. It has been making it for 25 centuries in every language into which it has been carried, and it makes it again now in the cool air of the conservation room above 2,000 years of carefully folded silk. The line is not a rhetorical gesture. It is not a philosopher's opening flourish designed to signal how serious and deep the text is about to be. It is a genuine epistemological claim, a considered position about the nature of knowing and the nature of language. And what it claims is this: the kind of mind that fixes things in language, that reaches for a concept and pins it down with a name, that requires its objects to hold still while it examines them, is structurally incapable of grasping the Tao directly. Not because the Tao is too complicated, not because the vocabulary is insufficient, not because a better word has not yet been invented, but because the act of naming is itself a kind of departure from the thing named. Every name is a map, and the Tao is not a territory that can be mapped, because a map requires that the territory stop moving long enough to be measured, and the Tao does not stop. What this means in practice is that the Tao Te Ching opens by announcing its own impossibility. It is a text about what cannot be fully contained in a text, written by someone who understood this and wrote anyway, because the alternative, silence, pure silence, the refusal to point at all, would leave the person at the mountain pass with nothing to carry west. Better to point, knowing the pointing falls short. Better to say, knowing the saying does not capture, because the gesture of pointing in the right direction has its own kind of value, even when the finger cannot reach the thing. The conservator sets down her instrument and sits for a moment with the manuscript before her. The silk holds the light in a particular way, not reflective, not bright, but softly present, the way old things are present when they have come through time without being in a hurry. Around her, the laboratory continues its quiet work. Outside, the world of 1973 continues its considerably less quiet work. And here, between her hands, the first sentence of the Tao Te Ching rests as it always has, in the middle of the gap it opened. The gap, it turns out, is not a problem, it is the whole point. There is an older text within the Tao Te Ching's own tradition of self-description, and it appears in chapter 25, near the middle of the arrangement that became canonical. It describes something that existed before heaven and earth, before the sky arched over the land, before the first river found its first valley, before any of the 10,000 particular things had separated themselves from the formless whole of which they were each a temporary expression. What existed before all this, the text says, was silent. It was boundless. It stood alone and did not change. It moved through everything and was not exhausted. He does not know its name, the author admits. He is forced to call it the Tao, to give it a word, knowing the word is approximate. Knowing the word lands somewhere near the thing, but not on it. The way a stone thrown in the dark lands somewhere in the field you are aiming for, and you hear the landing, but cannot see where. This unnamed ground, this formless, silent, boundless, prior thing, is described as the mother of the universe. Not a creator who stands apart from creation and builds it from outside, as a craftsman builds a table and remains distinct from the table when the work is finished. The Tao is not that kind of source. It is a generative ground that is always already present within the things it has generated, the way moisture is present within wood, the way quiet is present within sound, the way darkness is present within light, even at noon, not opposed, not absent, but underlying and intimate, never having left what it gave rise to. This is a different kind of cosmology than the one most Western philosophical traditions developed. The Tao does not make the world and then oversee it from a position of transcendence. It does not issue laws, does not reward or punish, does not require devotion or acknowledgement. It simply is what things are made of and move through and return to, as water is what a river is made of and moves through and returns to the sea in order to rise again as cloud and fall again as rain. The river neither owning the water nor producing it, but being the temporary shape the water has consented to take for a while. Mother is a careful word. It carries a philosophical weight that father does not carry in the same direction. The father stands over, names, separates, gives identity and distinction. The mother holds within, nourishes, does not distinguish the nourishing from the nourished, remains in the relationship after the act of giving is complete. The Tao Te Ching uses this image with care. The text will return to it, and to the broader philosophical privileging of the soft and yielding and receptive over the hard and asserting and dominant across dozens of chapters, with a consistency that makes clear it is not a stylistic accident, but a sustained philosophical commitment. But first, the act of naming itself. Chapter 1, in the arrangement that most readers encounter it, draws a distinction between two modes of the Tao that maps directly onto the distinction between naming and not naming. The nameless Tao, the chapter says, is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named Tao is the mother of the 10,000 things. This is not a contradiction, the same ground understood in two different relations. Without a name, the Tao is where everything begins, the formless generativity that precedes all differentiation. With a name, once the mind reaches out and calls it something, it becomes the mother, the organizing principle through which the 10,000 distinct things emerge from the undivided whole. What this suggests is that naming is not an arbitrary human imposition on a neutral world. Naming is how the world unfolds, the act of distinction, this from that, light from dark, high from low, being from non-being, is not a mistake the mind makes when it encounters reality. It is a cosmological event, a movement within the Tao itself, the way the first light separated itself from the first dark, and in doing so made both possible as objects of experience. The human mind naming things is continuous with the Tao, differentiating itself into the 10,000 things. The problem is not naming. The problem is forgetting that the 10,000 named things are still the one unnamed, ground wearing different shapes, mistaking the map for the territory, not because maps are bad, but because the territory has not been carried along inside them. The conservator reads the first character again. Around her, the laboratory is quiet. The characters on the silk are still exactly what they were 2,000 years ago. And in this stillness, the first line continues to do what it has always done, not close a question, but open a space. The way a window opened in a room that has been sealed suddenly shows the whole of the sky, which was always there, which never needed the window to exist, but which now enters the room and changes what is possible inside it. In the middle of the 17th century, in China, a Jesuit scholar sits at a low table with two books open before him. One is the Gospel of John, in the Latin Vulgate, its pages worn thin from years of use and travel. The other is a copy of the Tao Te Ching, the characters unfamiliar to his childhood eyes, but legible now after years of study and translation. He is working on a rendering of the Gospel's opening lines into classical Chinese, and he has paused at the word logos. In the beginning was the word. He sits with it, turning the word in his mind, listening to what it carries, its sense of rational order, of structure made visible, of meaning expressed outward into form. He reaches for the Tao Te Ching and reads the first line again, and for a long moment he considers whether the two texts might be speaking from the same place. He is not the first to see a resemblance. He will not be the last. The structural echo is genuinely there. Both texts open at the origin. Both locate a generative principle before heaven and earth. Both suggest that the origin and the derived are of the same nature, even as they differ in mode. He chooses, in the end, to translate logos as Tao, and the choice is not careless. In certain respects, the two words do reach toward each other, as words from very different traditions sometimes do, when they are both pointing at the same deep uncertainty about what precedes what. But the lamp on his table throws his shadow against the wall, and in that shadow he can see, perhaps, what the translation cannot hold. The logos is a word. It is fundamentally expressive, outward moving, structuring, luminous with intention. The Tao is, by its own first declaration, before any word, and any word spoken of it is already a deviation. The Logos is the rational principle through which all things were made, and reason and order are its native modes. The Tao is explicitly prior to reason, prior to order, prior to distinction of any kind. The Logos tends toward declaration. The Tao tends toward retreat. One announces, the other withdraws. One makes itself known. The other is most fully itself, in the moment before knowing. Apophatic is the word the theological tradition provides for a way of speaking about what cannot be spoken, defining by negation, by darkness, by the systematic stripping away of all the things a thing is not, in the hope that what remains when everything false is removed is the truth, even if the truth cannot be pointed at directly. The Tao Te Ching is one of the world's most fully apophatic texts. It does not say, the Tao is this. It says the Tao is not what you thought. It says whatever you have just named. That is not quite it. It says look where the light is not, and look in that direction for a long time, and what you find in that looking is not nothing. This apophatic quality is what makes the text so resistant to summary. Every summary of the Tao is a betrayal of the Tao, not because summaries are inherently bad, but because the text's central argument is that the conceptual mind's need for summary, its need for propositions, it can hold and examine and carry with it, is exactly the faculty through which the Tao cannot be grasped. To summarize, the Tao is like trying to catch the wind in a jar. The jar can be closed and labeled, but the jar does not contain the wind. It contains air, which was wind once before it was caught. The Jesuit scholar makes his notes. The lamp burns steadily. Outside his window, China is a country of enormous accumulated wisdom on this precise problem: how to speak of what exceeds speech, how to honor what exceeds honor, how to remain in relation with what exceeds all relation. And he is carrying into that country a tradition that has its own long conversation about the same impossibility, using different words, arriving from a different direction, but landing sometimes in the same quiet place. Chapter 4 of the Tao Te Ching offers an image that the Jesuit scholar might have held alongside his translation work with some benefit. The Tao, the chapter says, is an empty vessel that can never be filled, and its usefulness is inexhaustible. Empty, unfillable, inexhaustible, three qualities braided together in a way that is designed to stop the thinking mind, because by ordinary logic the three do not cohere. An empty vessel is one that has not yet been filled. An unfillable vessel is one that cannot receive, or one so vast that all filling leaves it still empty. But inexhaustible implies a source that keeps giving, that offers without being depleted. How can a vessel that is always empty be always giving? The answer the Tao Te Ching provides is not an argument. It is an image, and the image requires dwelling rather than solving. The emptiness is not a deprivation. It is a condition of possibility. A vessel that is already full cannot receive. A vessel that is always empty is always ready. The inexhaustibility is not a property of contents. It is a property of receptivity, a quality of the space that welcomes without hoarding and releases without losing. The Tao does not have things in reserve. It is the nature of things to flow through it without diminishing it. The way the valley does not diminish when the rain fills it, because the valley is not holding the rain. The valley is simply being the shape that makes gathering possible, and when the rain moves on, the valley remains exactly as it was. The Chinese word here is wu, emptiness, non-being, the absence that is not merely the absence of something, but the generative void through which all things become possible. Wu is not a negative term in the Tao Te Ching's philosophical vocabulary. It is one of the most important positive terms the text contains, because it describes the quality that makes the Tao inexhaustible, the quality that makes a wheel able to turn, a vessel able to hold, a room able to be inhabited. What is present serves a function. What is absent makes that function possible. Both are real, both are necessary, and the tradition of thought that knows only the present, only the full, only the thing that can be touched and named and verified, is missing exactly half of what is there. Wu makes a space in the argument, and in that space, something begins to happen that the argument itself cannot describe. The way a room makes a space for the life lived in it, and what the room is, really what it is in its essence, is not the walls or the floor, but that open center where everything occurs. The walls are the visible fact. The open center is the philosophical truth. The walls serve the center, and when a building stands for a very long time, it is the center, the space inside, the open nothing around which the visible everything is organized, that endures even when the walls have changed. This is a difficult idea to hold, and not because it is logically complex, but because it cuts against the deepest grain of how attention normally works. Attention goes toward what is present, what is bright, what declares itself. The empty hub of a wheel does not declare itself. The hollow of the bowl does not announce its presence. The open space of a room does not compete for attention with the walls and the furniture. And so the tradition that taught looking toward what is absent, receptive, yielding, dark, and low was always fighting a steady current in the opposite direction. The natural drift of mind toward the bright, the full, the assertive, the named. There is a valley in chapter 6 of the Tao Te Ching. It is not a specific valley, not a valley the reader can visit or locate on a map. It is the idea of a valley, the valley as philosophical symbol, and what it symbolizes is exactly this quality of emptiness that is not absence but depth. The valley spirit never dies. That is the chapter's opening line, its declaration, its small and unassuming banner. The valley spirit never dies, and it is called the mysterious female. The valley gathers because it is low. It persists because it does not resist. It survives every season because it does not claim anything of any season. It receives what comes, releases what goes, and remains exactly itself through every change. The mysterious female. The text has been choosing its words carefully throughout, and this phrase arrives with the weight of that care behind it. The mystery is not an ornament. It is the philosophical claim that the receptive depth is not a known quantity, not a thing that can be pinned and named and fully accounted for, but something that always exceeds the account. The feminine is not a biological designation. It is a philosophical orientation toward the low, the yielding, the receptive, the generative from within, rather than the assertive from without. It is the orientation the Tao itself maintains toward all things, not governing, not forcing, not displaying, but persisting in that quiet groundholding that makes all things possible without ever claiming credit for any of them. Chapter 6 ends with the image of the valley as the root of heaven and earth. The root. Not the summit, not the source conceived as the highest point from which things flow downward, but the root, underground, invisible, not announcing itself, pressing deeper into the dark earth rather than higher toward the bright sky. The root holds, the root nourishes. The root is what remains when everything above it has changed with the seasons, and the valley, by being low, by being receptive, by being the shape that gathers without grasping, is the root. In the conservation laboratory in 1973, the work has continued. The silk has been unrolled with enormous care. Both manuscripts lie flat now, side by side on the examination table, their characters patient in the new light after 2,000 years of darkness. What strikes the scholars who gather around them is not only the age of the texts, though the age is considerable, but the variations, places where one silk diverges from the other, places where both silks diverge from the Wang Bi edition that had been canonical for 17 centuries before their discovery. Characters slightly different, arrangements slightly altered, the order of the two sections reversed, so that what was known as the second part now comes first, and the familiar opening is numbered 38, and the text that has been read as a beginning is revealed to have been preceded, in this version, by all that came after it. What this reversal does for a reader who encounters it is not disturb the philosophy. The philosophy holds in either order. What it does is open the text back into its own instability, its own incompletion, its own quality as a thing that has been traveled through by time and has been changed by that traveling in ways that cannot all be recovered. There is no single Tao Te Ching. There are versions, and behind the versions there may have been an oral tradition that preceded all of them, a spoken text that was never fixed to silk or bamboo, but simply moved from voice to voice, changing as it moved, retaining what mattered and releasing what did not. the way the Tao itself moves through the 10,000 things, retaining everything and releasing nothing permanently, or releasing everything and retaining nothing permanently, which may be the same statement from a different angle. The scholar who holds the Mawangdui manuscript in her mind and then opens her canonical edition to what has always been Chapter 1 may notice something settle in her understanding, or may notice something open. The chapter that begins the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, does not become less true for being chapter 38 in another arrangement. It does not require the position of first to do its work. It only requires being read, slowly, as if for the first time, with the particular quality of attention that the text itself keeps modeling, the quality of attention that does not rush toward comprehension, that does not grip the meaning and hold it still, but simply allows the sentence to unfold in the mind, the way the valley allows the rain to gather, without directing it, without hurrying it, without already knowing what it means before it arrives. The sentence has been arriving for 25 centuries. It arrives now. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Everything the text has to say is already held within this sentence, the way the uncarved block holds within it every shape it has not yet been committed to. All the water images, all the valley images, all the counsel about yielding and returning and knowing when not to speak, they are already here in the gap between the word Tao and the knowledge that the word does not arrive at its subject. They are already here in the sound a sentence makes when it ends and leaves behind it, not a conclusion, but an opening. Some texts close as they go. They offer propositions, defend them, move toward certainty, accumulate their case. The Tao Te Ching moves in the other direction. Each chapter opens something that was already opening, adds a new angle to a thing already being seen from many angles, clears away one more layer of the automatic assumption that the world is what the accustomed mind already takes it to be. The text does not want to be finished. It does not want to have been read. It wants to be lived in, inhabited, returned to in the manner of the valley returning the rain to the sky, not because the valley intends the return, but because that is the nature of a space that receives without grasping. A room is being described, not by its walls or its floor or the furniture arranged inside it, but by the silence that lives inside it, the particular quality of air in a space that has not yet been spoken in, a stillness that is not empty, but full of what has not yet been said. The room is any room. It is the room in which the Tao Te Ching is being read tonight, in the dark, at whatever hour has grown late enough that the demands of the day have subsided and the quieter things have begun to come forward. It is the room the text itself makes each time it is opened, a space of receptivity, of not yet meaning, in which something that exceeds all the words used to point at it can almost, for a moment, be felt rather than understood. The walls of this room are made of the 4,000 words the text contains. They are very thin walls. The space inside them is very large, and the quality of that space, its particular silence, its depth, its capacity to hold without gripping, is not a property of the walls. It is a property of the opening the walls have agreed together to surround. There is a word the text uses in chapter 4 that comes back quietly across many chapters, often without announcing itself. Shwen, dark, deep, mysterious. Not dark as in threatening or obscure or hidden for strategic reasons. Dark as in prior to light, as in the condition before the first distinction, as in the depth of a well that holds cold water because it has never been exposed to the noon sun. Zhuan is the quality of the Tao that makes it prior to reason, prior to naming, prior to the bright surface of things where attention normally lives. Chapter 1 calls this quality Chuanzi Xuan dark, and darker still, the gate of all wonders, not the illumination of all wonders, the gate, the entrance, the threshold, the low and narrow opening through which everything that is wonderful has come, and will come, and continues to come, in the dark, without announcement. The scholar in the laboratory does not think about Swan in these terms tonight. She is thinking about the physical care the manuscripts require, about the conditions of preservation, about what the variations in the characters mean for the history of the text. But there is a moment, she may not notice it consciously, when she pauses over the character for dark, its two strokes making their small gesture on the aged silk, and something in the room is briefly different, not louder, quieter, as if the word has done what it has always done, which is to make room for what is prior to language, in the middle of language, where the reader is sitting. This is what chapter 6 means when it says the valley spirit never dies. Not that the symbol persists through time, though it does. Not that the text survives, though it has, but that the quality of receptivity, the deep opening that receives without directing, the low ground that gathers without hoarding, this is not a historical phenomenon. It is not something that was true in the 4th century BCE and has since become a matter of scholarship. It is the nature of things present in every moment of genuine stillness, in every breath drawn without agenda, in every instant when the mind that has been busy naming and categorizing and arranging pauses, and in that pause something older and quieter comes forward. The valley spirit never dies because it is not a thing that could die, not a presence that was once alive and has since passed away, but a quality of the ground itself, a structural feature of what it means for anything to exist at all. Things arise, they persist for a while, they return to what gave rise to them, as the rain returns to cloud and cloud returns to rain, and the cycle continues without a winner, without a destination, without a final version of the text that settles every question and seals every interpretation. The conservator in 1973 holds her instrument above the silk but does not touch it yet. The characters of the first line rest in the light. Around them, the silence of the laboratory is the silence of something very old that has been waiting very patiently and has not suffered from the waiting, because patience for something this old is not a discipline. It is simply what things are like when they have stopped being in a hurry, when the urgency that drives most thinking has subsided, and what remains is the quiet persistence of something that has been here since before the question of how long it has been here arose. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. She reads it one more time. The sentence does what it always does, and in the space the sentence makes, that particular silence that follows a statement which has just dissolved the ground it was standing on, the valley spirit holds, as it always holds, in the low and receptive place where the deepest things do not announce themselves, but simply persist, quietly, without needing to be anything other than what they already, unchangingly are. A potter in ancient China sits at her wheel in the gray light of early morning, the clay wet beneath her hands, the wheel turning with the particular slow momentum of something that has been set in motion and does not need to be pushed. She presses her thumb into the center of the rising clay, and the hollow opens. Not made, exactly, met. The clay goes down around the pressure, and the space at the center arrives, and she holds it there for a moment, her thumb still, the wheel still turning, feeling the thin wall between the hollow and her hand, understanding without needing to name it that the useful thing she is making is not the clay but the emptiness, the clay has agreed to surround. Chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching had been written, or gathered, or composed at the edge of departure, long before this morning. But the potter does not need the chapter. She has arrived at it through her hands. 30 spokes converge on the hub of a wheel, and it is the hole at the center that makes the wheel useful. Clay is shaped into a vessel, and it is the hollow inside that makes the vessel useful. Walls are built around a room, and it is the empty space within that makes the room habitable. The Tao Te Ching offers these 3 examples, one after another, quietly, as though it is showing something that should already be obvious, something that somehow keeps getting missed. What exists is useful. What does not exist is what makes it so. The potter's wheel slows and stops. She lifts her hands from the clay. The vessel sits there with its hollow interior, useful now, complete now, not because of what has been added to it, but because of what the clay was shaped to leave open. She does not think much about this. She has made hundreds of vessels, and they have all taught her the same thing, and she has never needed a word for it. The word, when it comes, is Wu Wei. Wu Wei is one of those terms that arrives in translation, wearing the wrong clothes. Non-action, it is usually called, and the phrase has a certain accuracy to it. The way a rough sketch captures the shape of something without catching, the way it moves. The character Wu means without, but the character Wei does not mean action in the broad sense. It means straining force, the kind of action that is directed, deliberate, effortful, the kind that announces itself as work, that labors visibly against resistance. Wu Wei, then, is action without that straining quality. It is the absence not of movement, but of forcing. It is what happens when engagement becomes so perfectly aligned with the nature of things that the effort disappears from it, the way a well-made key disappears into a lock it was cut for, turning without force because the fit is exact. The potter at her wheel knows this from the inside. The days when she forces the clay, when she is tired or distracted or in a hurry, the clay resists. The walls go uneven, the vessel loses its symmetry, the hollow drifts. The days when she is simply there, attentive without straining, the clay seems to do what it does, and her hands follow, and the vessel arrives. The doing and the not doing are so close together on those days that the difference is hard to name, but the vessels are not the same. The ones made without forcing are the ones that hold water. Chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching opens with a declaration so simple it is easy to pass over without stopping. The highest good is like water. That is all it says at first, and then it catalogs what it means. Water benefits all things without striving. It flows to the low places that others disdain. It does not compete, and because it does not compete, nothing is able to overcome it. The Tao Te Ching has a hero, and the hero is not a warrior or a sage standing on a mountain in clean robes. The hero is water. The hero is the thing that yields, that settles to the lowest available ground, that moves around every obstacle, not because it has calculated the path of least resistance, but because moving around what resists, it is simply what water does. There is a stream somewhere, and in this stream there is a stone. The water does not see the stone as an obstacle. The water does not decide to go around. The water arrives at the stone and goes around it, because yielding is its nature, because the path around is where the moving already wants to go, because there is no inner argument to resolve, no pride invested in going through. The stone is still there 10 years later, 100 years later, and the water, which was never where the stone is and never will be, has been everywhere else, has crossed plains and turned into clouds, and fallen as rain, and found its way back to the stream, and pass the stone again without looking up. The text watches this and does not make it a metaphor, or rather, it does not only make it a metaphor. The observation is also just a fact about water, and the Tao Te Ching is a text that trusts facts about water to carry their own weight. The argument does not need to be made, it needs only to be pointed at. Here is water. Watch what it does. Watch what persists. Persistence through yielding. The phrase sounds almost like a contradiction. It runs against something most people carry without noticing, a deep assumption that persistence is a quality of hardness, that what endures is what resists, that strength means the capacity to hold a position under pressure and not be moved. The Tao Te Ching looks at this assumption with great patience and great gentleness, and it disagrees entirely. The hard and strong occupy the position of death. Chapter 76 says, the soft and yielding occupy the position of life. A living tree bends, a dead one breaks. The infant, which will be returned to later, is maximally soft, and the Tao Te Ching insists on this softness, not as a vulnerability, but as a power, the particular power of something that has not yet stiffened into a defended shape. To understand what Wu Wei asks for, it helps to sit with what it asks against. The straining force that Wu names is not just physical, it is the effort of the ego to manage outcomes, to assert preferences, to impose the mind's preferred version of events on the events themselves. It is the internal labor of someone who cannot simply do a thing, who must also be seen to do it, who must also succeed, who must also be recognized for the success, who must also ensure the recognition matches the effort, who is, in this way, never quite present to the doing itself, but always slightly behind or ahead of it, managing the story. Wu Wei is not the absence of doing, it is the absence of that secondary project. It is action from which the ego has been, at least temporarily, withdrawn. This is easier to see in practice than to describe. A calligrapher's brush moves across paper. There are days when the calligrapher is watching himself work, aware of each stroke, comparing each character to an ideal version of itself, making small adjustments mid-stroke, arriving at a finished piece that is technically proficient and somehow lifeless. And there are days when the brush moves and the character arrives, complete, without being consulted, the wrist relaxed, the ink moving through the bristles at the right speed, the hand going where the character needs it to go before the mind has told it to. Both days produce marks on paper. Only one of them produces calligraphy. The difference is not skill. It is the quality of presence. It is whether the doing is inhabited or watched. Chapter 17 of the Tao Te Ching lays out a taxonomy of rulers that makes this argument at the scale of governance. The best ruler is barely known to exist. The next is loved. The next is feared. The worst is despised. This ranking runs directly counter to every political intuition that prizes visibility, influence, and the enacted display of power. The Tao Te Ching places at the apex of all governance the ruler whose name the people barely know, whose hand the people barely feel, in whose absence everything continues to function as though the ruler were present, because the ruler has aligned so completely with the natural order of things that interference is never required. When this ruler's work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." The political argument and the personal argument are the same argument. Both describe a form of effectiveness that operates not through assertion, but through alignment, not through force, but through the careful withdrawal of force at precisely the moments when force would distort. The best ruler is effective for the same reason the best calligrapher is effective. not because they are doing more, but because they have stopped doing the wrong thing. They have stopped imposing their preferred shape on a process that has its own preferred shape, and in stopping, they have allowed something better than their preference to arrive. Chapter 38 turns this into a critique of deliberate virtue, and the critique has an edge to it, though the edge is quiet. The highest virtue is not virtuous, the chapter begins, because it does not strive to be virtuous. Inferior virtue clings to virtue and never departs from it. On the surface, this looks like a paradox, the kind of playful inversion the Tao Te Ching deploys often, but the point is precise. When goodness is performed, when a person has decided to be good and is enacting that decision, monitoring their own goodness, comparing their behavior against a standard of goodness they carry internally, something has already gone wrong. The self-consciousness has introduced a gap between the person and the action. The virtue is real enough in its effects, but it is labored. It is, in the Tao Te Ching's terms, straining. This is aimed, with great philosophical care, at the Confucian tradition of moral self-cultivation, which held that the path to virtue was exactly this kind of conscious practice: ritual, examination, deliberate cultivation of correct feeling and correct behavior over a long period of time until the cultivated virtues became second nature. The Tao Te Ching does not deny that this produces a kind of goodness. It questions whether the goodness produced is the highest kind available. What the Confucian tradition calls the goal, deliberate virtue, consciously held, the Tao Te Ching calls a condition to be moved through, not a destination to rest in. The highest goodness is not achieved by practicing goodness. It is recovered by stopping the practice that covered it over. The argument implies something important about what human nature is underneath the cultivation. The Tao Te Ching does not believe that people are fundamentally self-interested or aggressive or disordered, requiring the discipline of virtue to bring them into alignment with the good. It believes they are already in alignment with the good, in the deep original sense that the uncarved block is already in alignment with all its possible forms. The cultivation does not add something that was absent. The cultivation, in its most useful function, simply stops removing what was always there. A ruler sits in a courtyard while the kingdom manages its own affairs. This is not negligence. It is not the absence of care. It is the most difficult of the political virtues, a deliberate and sustained trust in the order that arises when interference is withheld, a willingness to allow the natural intelligence of human communities to work without the constant correction of a hand that believes it knows better. In the villages at the edge of this kingdom, people are planting and harvesting and settling arguments and raising children, and none of them are thinking about the ruler, which is exactly the condition the ruler has been working toward all along. The work of Wu-Wei governance is the work of becoming unnecessary, the hardest work of all, perhaps, and the most invisible. All of this, the Tao Te Ching knows, is much easier to understand than to live. Chapter 78 states it plainly, in the measured tone of a text that has made its most important arguments and is now pausing to acknowledge the gap between what has been said and what can be done. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Nothing surpasses it for dissolving the hard and inflexible. Everyone knows this. Almost no one is able to practice it. The honesty of that observation is in its own way a form of kindness. The Tao Te Ching is not a text that pretends the principles it describes are easy to embody. It does not offer a program of 7 steps or a practice of daily cultivation that will, if followed correctly, produce the desired result. It offers an observation about the nature of things and then observes with no judgment visible in the observation that knowing and living remain separated by an enormous distance for almost all of us. The distance is not a failure. It is part of what is being described. The gap between understanding water and becoming water is not a deficiency to be corrected. It is the condition from which the practice begins, again, each day. What makes the gap so wide exactly? Chapter 78 already knows. The principles of yielding run against the grain of ego-driven behavior, against the instinct to defend, assert, and overcome that most people carry as a fundamental orientation to the world. This is not a flaw in the people. It is the accumulated weight of the defended self, the self that has learned, over many years of living, that it needs to protect certain things, assert certain positions, hold certain ground against the encroachment of other people and the unpredictability of circumstances. The defended self has real wisdom in it. It has survived. But survival and flourishing are not the same condition, and what protected the self in one set of circumstances has calcified over time into a permanent posture, a permanent readiness for contest that makes yielding feel not like wisdom, but like surrender. The stone in the stream is not choosing to be hard, it simply is, and water is not choosing to yield. It simply does. The human situation is more complicated and more interesting because it involves a self that is aware of the choice, aware of the gap, aware that the principle of yielding is not identical with the practice of yielding, and aware, and this is the most important part, that the awareness itself can become another kind of grasping. The person who decides to practice Wu Wei, who commits to a program of non-forcing, who monitors their own spontaneity for signs of improvement, has misunderstood something central. Wu Wei is not an achievement. It cannot be pursued in the way that other achievements are pursued. The attempting to do it perfectly is the exact thing that prevents it. A person sits with the impulse to defend themselves in an argument. The other person has said something that is not quite fair, not quite accurate, something that needs to be corrected. The impulse arrives immediately, a tightening, a readiness, the words already forming. And for a moment, before speaking, something else is possible. Not the suppression of the impulse, not the deliberate choice to appear calm while remaining inwardly contracted. Simply a breath. A single breath, and in the space that breath opens, the impulse moves through without being caught. The thing that felt so solid, the position to be defended, the self that needed defending, is slightly less solid on the other side of the breath. Not gone, not resolved, just lighter. The argument continues, but differently, because one participant has briefly stopped trying to win it. This is not Wu Wei at full expression. It is a small act, barely visible, one breath in an ordinary day. But the Tao Te Ching is not a text that argues for grand transformations. It is a text that trusts the small and the gradual the way it trusts water, not because water occasionally does something dramatic, but because water never stops. The principle is available in the breath, the same way it is available in the century. It takes a river to open limestone into a canyon. The scale changes. The principle does not. A person stands at the edge of a canyon in the dry, high country, somewhere west of anywhere they have been before. The canyon walls go down 200 feet, 300. The stones striped in the slow colors of sediment, red, gray, ochre, the particular orange of iron oxide meeting air. A river runs at the bottom, thin and silver from this height, moving with the unhurried authority of something that has been here so long that it no longer needs to announce its intentions. The canyon is not dramatic to the river. The canyon is simply where the river is. The stone that has been removed, all of it, every cubic foot of limestone and sandstone that the canyon represents, was not overcome. It was not fought. It was met slowly with the patient dissolution of a force that never gets tired because it never strains. The person standing at the rim of that canyon does not think, I should be more like that river. The thought would be too effortful, too deliberate, too close to what chapter 38 was warning against. But something is received, standing there. Something about patience and the quiet effectiveness of yielding. Something about how much can be accomplished by a force that never announces itself, never celebrates its accomplishments, never stops. The observation is received without needing to be made useful. It is enough to stand there and see it. Water has been moving through this image since the Tao Te Ching first opened chapter 8. It does not stop moving. It benefits all things. It seeks the lowest places. It does not compete. It makes the soft argument for softness, not by claiming power, but by having it, not by asserting its credentials, but by dissolving everything that stands in the way of what needs to dissolve. The text presents water not as an analogy for something else, but as the most accurate description available of the way a person might live if they could hold what they know without forcing it, act without straining, and trust the principle they understand to work in them, the way the river works in stone, slowly, continuously, without announcement. The hardest part of this, the part chapter 78 acknowledges without flinching, is that almost no one practices it. This is not a judgment. It is an observation. The gap between knowing and living is real and wide and not easily closed, and the Tao Te Ching does not pretend otherwise. But the observation is followed by something that looks, in context, like a kind of hope, not the bright hope of a promise, but the quieter hope of a principle that remains available, regardless of how often it is missed. Water does not stop being water because the stone has not yet dissolved. The principle of yielding does not become less true because most people find it very difficult to embody. The canyon is there, patient, demonstrating something to anyone who comes to the edge and looks down. Chapter 8 had called water the philosophical hero of this text, though it did not use those words. It simply listed water's qualities, one after another, like a character reference for something that will never need a reference. It benefits without striving. It occupies the low places. It does not contend, and in not contending, the text says, it comes near the Tao, near but not identical. Even water as a metaphor is only a pointing finger. The Tao itself remains behind the pointing, but the pointing is useful. The images in this text, water, the valley, the wheel's empty hub, the vessel's hollow, are useful not because they are metaphors for an abstraction, but because they are themselves demonstrations. The hollow of the vessel is not a symbol for emptiness. It is emptiness, doing its work, making the vessel a vessel rather than a lump of clay. The water is not a symbol for yielding. It is yielding, in its most accomplished form, doing what yielding does over 10,000 years of quiet, continuous effort. The text is not pointing away from the world. It is pointing at the world and saying, look at this, already here, already practicing what is being described. The calligrapher's brush touches the paper. The character begins to arrive. The wrist is relaxed. The ink moves without being pushed. Something in the quality of this, the particular ease of an action that is not forced, the way the character seems to come from somewhere slightly larger than the person holding the brush, something in this quality is what the Tao Te Ching has been circling around from the beginning. Not the character itself, not the skill, the quality of the ease, the space that opens in the middle of a well-made thing, the way hollow opens in the center of a well-made vessel. The empty space is not decorative. The empty space is the point. There is something that good potters know about the clay, good calligraphers know about the brush, good rulers know about governance. It is not easily taught, and the Tao Te Ching acknowledges this with great honesty. It can be pointed at. It can be illustrated by water, by the canyon, by the long patience of a river moving through stone over centuries. But the knowing that lives in the body, the knowing that the potter has in her hands, that the calligrapher has in the wrist, that is neither tight nor slack, that knowing is only available in the doing, and the doing changes over a long time, slowly, the way the river changes the stone, not by force, by persistence, by the slow accumulation of small moments when the force is withheld and the yielding allowed, until, over time, the yielding begins to be the first response, rather than the one arrived at after great effort and self-correction. Everyone knows the soft overcomes the hard. Almost no one practices it. Chapter 78 holds these two sentences together without distress, because the distance between them is not a crisis. It is the condition from which a long, unhurried practice begins. The canyon did not form overnight. The river did not force anything. It simply moved, and the stone eventually opened, because that is what stone does when water has been patient long enough, and patient in the right way, not gritting through, not asserting, not announcing, but simply continuing, the way water continues, the way the principle continues, present and available, and in no particular hurry, because the stone is going nowhere, and the river is in no danger of running dry. The stream moves around the stone in the particular quality of light that comes just before evening, when the shadows go long across the water, and the sound of the current is the loudest thing in the valley. The stone is exactly where it has always been. The water is exactly where water is. The potter's wheel has stopped turning, and the vessel sits on the work table with its hollow interior, useful now, waiting to hold something. The calligrapher sets down the brush and looks at the finished character without pride or disappointment, simply seeing it, the way the sage sees what is there. The knowing and the living are still separated by the same enormous distance they have always been separated by. The Tao Te Ching knows this and is not discouraged by it. A principle that is true does not become less true because it is difficult. Water does not become less patient because the stone is hard. The soft overcomes the hard. The yielding overcomes the firm. The river continues. The stone very slowly opens, and the gap between knowing this and living it, that gap, which is wide and real and honestly acknowledged, is not a wall. It is a threshold. The knowing and the living begin, very slowly, to move toward each other, the way water moves toward the lowest available ground, not in a single moment, but in the long, unhurried, continuous way that is the only way anything lasting ever gets done. An unnamed artisan of the Han Dynasty lifts a block of uncarved wood from a workbench in the early morning, before the light has fully arrived in the workshop, and turns it slowly in both hands. The grain runs lengthwise. The surface is cool and slightly rough. He has been commissioned to carve a figure of a bird for a provincial magistrate, and the commission is a generous one, and the wood is good. He stands there for a long moment, turning the block. Then he sets it down again, untouched, and goes to stand by the open doorway and look out at the yard where the dew is still on the grass, the tools behind him waiting, the block on the workbench waiting, and the decision not to begin the most important decision of the morning. In the Tao Te Ching, this is not hesitation. It is not the craftsman doubting his skill or fearing the work ahead. It is something the text describes again and again, from many different angles and with many different images, arriving each time at the same quality of stillness, the capacity to hold possibility before the shaping begins, to remain with the uninterrupted wholeness of a thing before any one form has been chosen, and all the others set aside. The word for this is pu. It means uncarved block, or unhewn wood, or raw simplicity, pure potential that carries all possible forms at once, precisely because it has not yet been committed to any single one. The artisan standing at the doorway, the wood waiting on the bench behind him, both are somehow inside the concept that pu is pointing toward, and neither can explain it in terms of any other idea, because pu is not a refined concept, but a prior one, something closer to the wood itself than to any carving that might come from it. Laozi returns to pu throughout the text, not as an intellectual abstraction, but as a description of a quality that human beings can cultivate in themselves. The sage, in his account, maintains something like the condition of the uncarved block, not by avoiding culture or refusing knowledge, but by holding learning lightly, never mistaking the shaped figure for the living wood it was shaped from. There is a difference, the text insists, between a person who has learned many things and then holds those many things as definitions of reality, and a person who has learned many things and still, underneath all of it, carries the original uninterrupted wholeness from which learning came. The second person moves differently. Their knowledge sits in them without weight. What they say arrives with the quality of something spoken for the first time, even if it has been said before, because they have not hardened around it. The artisan eventually turns back from the doorway and picks up the block again. The bird is still there as a commission, still there as an intention, but the quality of how he picks up the block has changed in the time he spent not beginning. Something has been allowed to settle. The tools feel differently in his hands, not heavier, not lighter, but more present, as if they have been returned to him from a place he did not know he had sent them. He begins, and the work goes easily, the grain of the wood doing half the work by itself. There is a valley that appears in the 6th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, and it has been there for 2,500 years, and it is still exactly as it was. The valley spirit never dies, the text says. It is called the mysterious female. The gateway of the mysterious female is called the root of heaven and earth. Dim and obscure, it appears to endure. Its use is inexhaustible. The valley in this passage is not a geographical feature. It is a cosmological symbol, and what it is a symbol of is the principle of emptiness, receptivity, and depth, not the emptiness of a container that has been drained of its contents, but the emptiness that was there before any content arrived. The hollow in the stone that rain finds, not because rain searches for it, but because the hollow is a shape that makes gathering possible. Throughout the Tao Te Ching, Laozi consistently and deliberately aligns the Tao with what ancient Chinese thought identified as feminine qualities: the low, the receptive, the still, the dark, the hidden, the yielding, and does so not as a passing metaphor, but as a systematic philosophical argument. Where most cosmological systems in the ancient world, including most of the Chinese systems the text was responding to, placed brightness, height, hardness, and assertion at the top of the hierarchy, Laozi inverts the ordering entirely. The valley, not the peak; the root, not the branch; the dark, not the light; the quiet that persists beneath all noise, not the noise that draws attention to itself. The gateway of the mysterious female is the root of heaven and earth, because what gives rise to things is not the assertive, visible force, but the receptive, invisible depth from which visible things emerge and to which they return. The valley does not announce its function. It does not demonstrate its usefulness. It simply holds the shape that makes gathering possible. And what gathers there? Rain, mist, shadow, silence gathers without being asked. The text points at this again and again, in simply like, but what the what way, in different images but with the same direction. The deepest power is the kind that does not display itself. The most enduring virtue is the kind that does not know it is virtuous, and the most fundamental ground is the one that seems, to eyes looking for brightness and height, like mere absence. The valley spirit never dies precisely because it never asserts itself. Nothing finds it necessary to overcome it. Nothing finds it necessary to challenge it. It is already in the low place, already yielding, already open, and the Tao that moves through all things moves through it most freely of all. There is a potter at work, not the artisan with the wood, but another figure, in another workshop, in another season, her hands wet and turning on the wheel, the clay rising between her palms. The 11th chapter of the Tao Te Ching builds its argument out of 3 ordinary objects, and one of them is a clay vessel, and the argument it makes is so simple and so strange that it is worth sitting with slowly. 30 spokes share the wheel's hub, the text says, and it is the center hole that makes it useful. Clay is shaped into a vessel, and it is the space within that makes it useful. Walls and roof make a room, and it is the empty space inside that makes the room useful. Therefore, what exists serves for profit, but what does not exist serves for use. The hollow is not a flaw in the vessel, it is the vessel's function. The empty center of the wheel is not the absence of wood, but the presence of the capacity to turn. The open space of a room is not what is left over after the walls are built. It is what was always the point. The potter's hands press inward on the rising clay, and the hollow opens at the center, exactly where her thumbs press down and curve. She is not removing material. She is shaping the space inside the material, guiding the clay around an emptiness that was never not there, making visible what the wheel's turning already contained as possibility. What she holds when she lifts the finished vessel is not only the clay, but the hollow the clay has agreed to carry. The weight of the pot in her hands is partly the clay and partly the absence of clay, and without the second, the first would be useless, beautiful perhaps, solid certainly, but without the capacity to hold water, to hold grain, to hold oil, to be of any use to anyone who needs a thing contained. This is the argument that Chapter 11 is making, but the argument is not offered as a position to be debated. It is offered as 3 images to be felt. The wheel, the pot, the room, each one ordinary, each one daily, each one demonstrating, without needing to announce it, that the empty and the present are not opposites but partners, and that in every structure we build, in every tool we shape, in every space we enter, the useful thing and the space that makes it useful are inseparable, and what the eye tends to value, the solid, the visible, the shaped, exists entirely in service of what the eye tends to overlook. The hollow in the pot is real. That is the philosophical claim, and it is a stranger claim than it first appears. The space inside the vessel is not nothing. It has a shape, a quality, a function. It is what the vessel is for. And if the space inside the vessel is real in this sense, if emptiness can have function, then the Tao Te Ching's insistence that the Tao itself is characterized by emptiness, by the unnameable hollow at the center of all things, is not a mystical gesture into the indefinite, but a practical observation about the structure of the world. What holds everything together is not a presence, but a kind of organized absence. The spaces between things are as real as the things. What has not yet been said is as real as what has been spoken. What remains uncarved is as real as the figure that might be carved from it. The potter sets the finished vessel on a shelf to dry. She will not fill it today. The hollow inside it rests in the cool air of the workshop. Cleave tonight, while then we wind. The total lack of self-consciousness about the effortlessness is itself part of what makes the effortlessness possible. The mud is in the water, and the question is whether the one who holds the disturbed water can simply wait, not stir harder, not add anything, not attempt to accelerate the settling, but simply hold the vessel still and allow what gravity and time will accomplish on their own. The clarity is not something you achieve. It is what the water is when you stop disturbing it. The settling is the thing that happens when you withdraw the force that was keeping the sediment in suspension. This is chapter 15 arriving. Again, at the same place all the images in the Tao Te Ching arrive. The recognition that the most fundamental qualities of the Tao, clarity, order, ease, the right action arising in the right moment, are not achievements but returns, not gains but recoveries of what was present before the interference began. A figure stands at the edge of a frozen river in the early morning of a winter that is beginning to soften toward spring. The crossing is necessary. There is somewhere to be, something to attend to on the far bank. The ice is good but not certain, thickened by months of cold, but beginning now to hold, faintly the warmth that has started to move through the air a few hours before dawn. Each step is placed. Each step asks the ice a question and waits for the answer before the next step is placed. The far bank is visible, pale in the early light, the trees there dark against a sky that has not yet decided what color it will be today. The crossing will take as long as it takes. The ice will hold or it will not, and the manner of walking is the only thing that can be offered to the question, and the manner of walking is already as good as it can be, already the full expression of a careful attention that has no other agenda. In the portrait the text is building, the sage is not a superhuman figure. The sage is not someone who has transcended ordinary experience or who operates in a rarefied state, inaccessible to everyone else. The sage is recognizable in these images, careful, yielding, simple, murky when disturbed, able to wait for the settling. These are not exotic qualities. They are qualities available in any body that has learned to stop insisting on being something other than what the moment requires. The sage sees what is there, not what should be there, not what was there yesterday or what might be there tomorrow. What is there exactly in the form it has taken, in this moment, before anything has been added or removed? And what the sage sees in the busy market, or at the edge of the frozen river, or in the workshop where the wood is waiting, is simply the 10,000 things moving in their 10,000 ways, each one already in its right relation to everything else, each one already doing what its nature requires, without needing to be corrected, or managed, or improved. The woman with the basket, the child, the argument at the merchant's stall, the ice, the cold, the light beginning to come. None of it asking for anything other than to be seen clearly, without the distortion that the observing self introduces when it projects its preferences and fears onto the surface of what is there. The mirror metaphor is not explicit in the Tao Te Ching, but it is implicit in almost every description of the sage's mode of perception, where an ordinary person looks at the world through a kind of screen, a screen made of wants, fears, judgments, memories of how things were, and preferences for how things should be. The sage's perception is described as something more like a still surface that simply reflects what is there, without adding or subtracting, without the distortion that turbulence introduces. This is not a cold or mechanical mode of seeing. It is, in the Tao Te Ching's account, the warmest and most accurate mode of perception available, because it receives the 10,000 things without demanding that they be other than they are, which is the closest possible form of respect for the particular reality of each. The sage at the edge of the market does not see a crowd. The sage sees the woman carrying the basket, the child, the argument at the stall, each one particular, each one real, each one received exactly as it is. The crowd is what you see when you have stopped looking carefully. The particular is what remains when the screen of category and projection has been stilled enough that the individual thing can come through. What the text is pointing at, through the mirror and the valley and the ice and the uncarved wood, is not a state of detachment. The Taoist sage is not a figure of removal. The sage is engaged, completely, fully, quietly engaged, but the engagement has no agenda that the engagement serves. It is engagement in the way that still water is engaged with the moon that rises above it, completely present to the reflection, perfectly responsive to every change in the light, and needing nothing from the moon at all. The block of uncarved wood sits on the workbench in the artisan's shop, and the morning has fully arrived now, the light coming in from the east and falling across the grain of the wood in long horizontal lines that show the growth of each year. The artisan has returned from the doorway. The tools are in his hands. The bird that the magistrate commissioned is there as an intention in the space between the artisan and the wood, not yet carved, not yet committed to one set of choices over all the others that the wood could support. He stands with the intention without rushing toward it. He allows the wood a few more moments of being everything it might be before it becomes the particular thing it will be. This is not delay. This is not indecision. This is the artisan doing what the text has been describing all along in its images of valleys and infants and sages crossing ice, holding the full possibility of the moment before any one choice has narrowed it to itself, attending to what is there before adding what is wanted, allowing the grain of the wood and the quality of the light and the shape of the commission to come together into the natural place where the first cut belongs. When that place becomes clear, the work will begin, and when it begins, it will move as the text says the ancient masters moved, carefully as someone crossing a river in winter, yielding as ice about to melt, simple as uncarved wood, which is, for a few more moments, exactly what this is. The hollow in the pot holds the cool air of the workshop. The valley in its deep shade has already received the morning's first rain and held it without moving. The infant in its sleep opens its fists slightly, then closes them again around nothing, around the shape that nothing makes when a small hand curls toward its palm in the deep and unself-conscious rest of a body that has not yet learned to be anxious about resting. Chapter 15 asks, who can remain still until the moment of action? The question does not demand an answer. It sits the way the uncarved block sits, not empty, but full of what has not yet been committed to. The ancient masters could remain still, not because stillness was their goal, but because they had understood, through whatever long practice or long attention had brought them to that understanding, that the moment of action arrives on its own, when the interference that delays it has been withdrawn, the way the mud settles on its own when the hand that stirred it has gone still, and the muddy water clears. It takes time. It takes the particular patience that is not waiting for something, but simply allowing the process that is already underway to continue without interruption. And when it clears, what becomes visible through the settled water is not something new. It is the floor of the vessel, the ground that was always there, simply obscured for a while by what was stirred up, and now returned to visibility by the oldest and quietest force in the Tao Te Ching's account of things: the willingness to do nothing, to add nothing, to remain still while the 10,000 things continue their 10,000 movements, and allow the settling to happen on its own, in its own time, arriving at its own transparency without being helped. The artisan lifts his tool. The first cut finds the grain. The valley deepens into shade as the morning sun moves. The infant breathes. The sage steps carefully onto the ice, and the ice holds, and the far bank is still there, pale and quiet in the early light, waiting with the particular patience of something that has always been across the river and will be across the river long after this crossing is finished, present in the same way the uncarved wood is present, holding its possibility without announcing it, available to whatever the morning's attention is careful enough to find. Zhuangzi set down his brush in the 4th century before the Common Era, and for a moment he simply sat. The story of the cook and the ox was complete on the paper before him. He had written it quickly, the way things arrive when they have been living in the body long before they find words. And now the room was quiet, and the brush was still, and outside the window, whatever wind was moving through the trees was moving through them in exactly the way wind always had, indifferent to the fact that something had just been written down. He had not invented the cook. He had watched people like him. He had watched the way a skilled hand finds the natural hollow between things and moves along it rather than through it. And he had understood that this was not a skill confined to kitchens or to knives, that the ox was a stand-in for everything a person might encounter in a life. The difficulties and the structures and the places where things had always been joined, and that the blade which never dulls is the one that never forces. He sat with this for a while longer. The paper dried. The story remained exactly as he had left it, which is what stories do when they are finished. There is a word in the Tao Te Ching for what Zhuangzi had just written about, though the text approaches it from a different angle. The word is ziran. It appears in chapter 25, in the passage where the Tao itself is described as vast and unnameable, moving through all things and returning to them, and at the end of that passage, the text makes an almost startling claim that the Tao follows its own nature, and its own nature alone. Ziran is sometimes translated as naturalness, sometimes as spontaneity, and sometimes most literally as self-so-ness, the quality of being exactly what one is, not performing it, not achieving it, simply being it, the way water is wet without effort, and stone is hard without trying. The word carries no instruction. It does not say become natural. It says notice that everything is already entirely itself, and has been the whole time, and that the interference of the mind that wants to manage and improve and correct is the only thing that has ever interrupted that. This is not a passive teaching. It would be easy to read Ziran as a counsel towards stillness, towards sitting and doing nothing while the world arranges itself. But what the Tao Te Ching proposes is something more precise and in its way more demanding, that the mind be allowed to settle until it can perceive what is already there and respond to that, rather than to its own projections about what should be there. The cook is not passive. He is fully present. His entire attention is in the knife, in the hollow between the joint and the bone, in the particular structure of this particular ox on this particular morning. He is not applying a general theory of butchery. He is following what is actually there. And when the work is done, he stands quietly, neither proud nor diminished, because the achievement was not his in the way that victories are usually said to belong to the person who fought for them. He simply went where the ox's own structure offered to take him. Zhuangzi understood this not as an argument, but as a way of moving through the world. He had watched it in craftsmen and had suspected it was available to anyone who was willing, over a long enough time, to stop imposing the shape they wanted things to have and begin attending to the shape things already held. This is a difficult thing to describe. It is easier to demonstrate it, which is why he told stories rather than constructing formal arguments. The story of the cook says something that a philosophical treatise about non-action cannot quite reach, because the treatise is still a product of the conceptual mind, still arranged and deliberate, while the story of the cook contains within itself the quality it is pointing toward, the blade finding what is already open, the movement that looks from the outside like ease. Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching begins with a specific instruction that is also, if held long enough, a description of what the mind is like when it stops fighting itself. Empty yourself of everything, the text says. Let the mind become still. And then, before the instruction is even finished, the teaching shifts its register entirely and becomes simply a description of what is happening all the time, whether the mind attends to it or not. The 10,000 things rise and fall. They return, each of them, to the root from which they came. This return is called stillness. Stillness is called the fulfillment of what each thing was always meant to be. What this passage asks for is not suppression. The mind is not told to stop thinking, the way one might stop a clock. What it describes is closer to what happens to water when it is no longer stirred. The sediment, which was always going to fall, falls. The turbulence which was added subsides. And what remains is not a new condition, but the original one, the clarity that was always there beneath the disturbance. The 10,000 things rise and fall in the mind, the way they rise and fall in the world. A thought appears, and then it is gone, and then another, and the one who watches this is not diminished by the watching. The self does not have to defend itself against the rising and falling. It is not the things that rise and fall, it is the stillness in which they do. This is the contemplative ground the Tao Te Ching keeps returning to from different directions, through different images, with the patience of a text that knows it cannot be said once and grasped. Chapter 56 observes that those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know, which could be taken as a paradox about a text that speaks extensively about the unknowable. But the text is not confused about this. It knows it is a gesture towards something it cannot deliver directly. It knows the words are fingers pointing at a moon that the fingers do not illuminate and cannot hold. What chapter 56 describes is a form of knowing that is prior to language, available in the silence between thoughts, rather than in the thoughts themselves. And the consistent privileging of darkness over illumination throughout the text is part of this same philosophical movement, the preference for what retreats over what advances, for what abides in the low and quiet places, rather than what announces itself from the heights. The ancient masters, chapter 15 says, were darkly perceptive, profoundly wise. This is not a failure of translation. The darkness is the point. What the text calls wisdom here is not the bright competence of the person who has answers ready for every question, but the willingness to remain in not knowing long enough that something older and quieter than conceptual certainty becomes available. This is a form of attention, not a form of emptiness. The master who crosses the frozen river in winter is not proceeding with calm disinterest. Every step is fully attended to. The ice is real. The cold is real. The far bank is real. Nothing is being suppressed or transcended. What has been abandoned is only the noise of premature certainty, the assumption that the river is already crossed before the crossing has begun. In a corner of a room in the 4th century, before the Common Era, Zhuangzi's story sat drying on its paper, and outside the window the wind continued through the trees. The story was finished. The cook had set down the knife and stood in the particular quiet of someone who had done a thing without making himself the center of it. And the ox, what had been the ox, lay open, its own structure having provided everything the work required. Neither the cook nor the ox had argued with their natures, and the result was not a triumph, but simply the completion of something that had been, in some sense, always going to happen. The ego, as the Tao Te Ching understands it, is not a fixed thing to be defeated, but a kind of contraction, a habitual tightening of attention around the story of the self, its preferences and its fears, its need to be credited and its dread of being diminished. The text does not argue that the self is an illusion in the way that certain other traditions might approach this territory. What it argues is gentler and in its way more practical, that the self held loosely is larger than the self held tight. Chapter after chapter returns to this, through images of giving and not hoarding, acting and not claiming the action, achieving and not dwelling on achievement. Give without expecting return, act without claiming credit. Complete the work and then step back, because the river does not wait at the bank, admiring the distance it has traveled. This is not self-erasure. The cook is still there. His skill is real. His attention is his own. What is not there is the layer of performance that follows most skilled action, the looking around to see who noticed, the measuring of the result against some internal standard of how it was supposed to go. That layer is the friction, and its absence is not coldness or indifference, but something more like presence, the full arrival in the actual moment of the actual work, without the work having to be anything other than what it is. A person walking from one room to another, carrying a cup of water, if for just a moment the narrative commentary falls away, is simply doing that, moving through the air of the house, the cup in hand, the water resting in the cup, the particular quality of light in whatever room is being moved through. Nothing is being narrated, nothing is being assessed. The action is complete in itself, requiring no commentary to make it real, and in that small, ordinary completeness is something that the Tao Te Ching has been approaching from every available angle for 2,500 years. Not an insight to be achieved, a recognition available to anyone who has stopped for long enough, adding to what is already there. The text's systematic deconstruction of the ego is not harsh. There is no rhetoric of shame in it, no insistence that the self is a prison from which one must be freed. The tone is more like a gentle, repeated invitation to hold the self a little less firmly, to notice that the hand that grips the water cup too tightly is more likely to spill the water than the hand that holds it well, with exactly the attention the cup requires, and nothing more. The Tao Te Ching trusts the natural intelligence of things to find their level when the compulsive intelligence of the ego stops insisting on its own routing. The water finds the low place, the thought finds its conclusion, the action finds its completion. And the person through whom all of this moves, if they have learned to move the way water moves, arrives where they were going without the journey having cost them more than the journey actually cost. There is a particular quality to this kind of knowing. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the sense that something has been completed and can now be put away. Chapter 16's arc, the emptying, the settling, the watching, describes not a destination, but a movement that can be entered at any time, and which, once entered, simply continues. The 10,000 things rise and fall. They return to the root. The root is stillness, and the stillness is not separate from the rising and the falling, but is their ground, the thing they rise from and return to, present throughout, without being visible from within the movement itself. Zeron and this stillness are related in a way the text does not need to explain. To be self-so is to be rooted in the ground of one's own nature. To watch the 10,000 things rise and fall is to have found, or to have remembered, the place in which one is rooted. The two teachings arrive at the same clearing from different paths. The cook finds it through his knife. The master finds it through the crossing of the frozen river. Zhuangzi finds it after setting down his brush. Each of them arrives not at a conclusion, but at a quality of rest that is indistinguishable from full presence, the state in which nothing is being held away from the moment, and nothing is being added to it, in which the moment is simply what it is, and is received exactly so. Chapter 56 goes on from its observation about speaking and knowing to describe what it calls the mysterious equalizing, the blunting of sharpness, the untying of knots, the softening of glare, the settling of dust. This is not a list of suppressions. It is a description of what the mind looks like when it has stopped cutting everything apart, stopped working to distinguish itself from everything it encounters, stopped glaring at the world with the bright, demanding energy of a self that needs the world to confirm it. The dust settles, the knots untie, the sharpness finds its natural edge rather than the edge it was grinding itself against. And the person who has come to rest in this does not stand apart from the 10,000 things, does not look at them from a distance of practiced indifference, but moves among them in something more like companionship, knowing that they too are following their natures, that they too are self-so, that the whole field of things is already doing what it is doing and has been the whole time. Late in the tradition that continued after the Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi would sit at his writing table for years, adding to a body of work that dramatized these principles through stories rather than maxims. He told the story of the cook and the ox. He told the story of a man who forgot he was a man and dreamed he was a butterfly, and who woke uncertain whether he was a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man. He was not troubled by this. He found it in the way the Tao Te Ching finds its hardest questions, a source of philosophical openness rather than anxiety, a loosening of the certainty that any particular boundary is fixed, any particular form is final, any particular self is as solid as the habit of inhabiting it suggests. What Zhuangzi extended from the Tao Te Ching, and what the Tao Te Ching itself had always carried, is this: the universe is not indifferent to the things within it. Indifference would be a kind of stance, and the Tao does not take stances. The Tao is the ground from which all things emerge, and to which all things return, and this returning is not a loss, but a fulfillment, the way a breath completes itself in the exhale, the way a river completes itself when it reaches the sea, not because it disappears, but because it has arrived at something continuous with what it always was. The 10,000 things are not separate from the Tao. They are the Tao in motion, and the person who has learned to hold themselves lightly is not separate from the 10,000 things. They are among them, moving in the same continuous field, rooted and branching at once. There is a pine tree at the edge of a mountain pass, and the wind through that pass has been moving for centuries before any person stood at the tree's foot and looked up at its branches. The tree is old. Its bark has been shaped by the particular weather of that particular elevation, and its roots have found their way into cracks in the stone that were not made for them, but which the roots, over time, and with the particular patience of things that grow rather than move, have widened enough to hold.